Ma'am, if you don't have enough money, maybe you shouldn't be banking here." The words slammed into Margaret Collins, a 74-year-old black woman, like a punch to the gut. She stood at the counter, her trembling fingers clutching her bank statement. For decades, she'd managed her money with care, never begging for handouts. But today, hundreds of dollars had vanished from her account, swallowed by mystery fees. All she wanted was an explanation. Jessica Parker, the young white teller, didn't even look up from her screen. With an irritated sigh, she flicked her hand like she was shooing a fly. "It's all in the fine print, lady. Maybe you should have read it." A couple of folks in line behind her snickered under their breath. Margaret's cheeks burned. She'd been with Westwood Community Bank for over 30 years, but today, she was just a nuisance, like she didn't belong. Then came the knockout blow. David Langston, the branch manager, strutted up in his sharp navy suit, his smile thin and phony as a $3 bill. "Problem here?" he asked, his voice oozing condescension. Jessica smirked. "Just a customer who doesn't get how banking works." David crossed his arms. "Ma'am, if you can't keep the minimum balance, maybe this isn't the bank for you." The lobby went dead quiet. Nobody said a word. Nobody had her back. Margaret's stomach sank, not because of the money, but because of how they stared at her, like she was nothing. Then, from the back of the room, a deep voice sliced through the silence, calm, steady, but loaded with raw authority. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The whole bank froze. Heads whipped toward the door. A guy in a black tee and a fitted cap stepped forward. At first, he looked like any other customer. Then he pulled off his cap. Gasps erupted. Chris Carter. Not just any Chris Carter. The NFL Hall of Famer. The legend millions idolized. And right now, he wasn't just standing in a bank. He was standing up for her. David frowned, his confidence flickering like a dying bulb. "And who exactly are you?" Chris tilted his head, his gaze locking onto David's with a quiet, unshakable authority that filled the room. "Someone who doesn't like seeing good people get pushed around." Margaret turned to Chris, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You know who I am?" Chris flashed a warm, steady smile. "No, ma'am, but I know what's right." Jessica shot a nervous glance at David, her smugness fading fast, as she sensed the power shifting under their feet. Chris faced Margaret again. "Ma'am, would you mind showing me what's going on?" Margaret paused, then handed over the crumpled bank statement, her hands still trembling. Chris scanned it in seconds, his jaw tightening before he looked back at David. "These charges shouldn't be here." His voice was calm, but there was a steel edge that made David's throat bob. David forced a chuckle, desperate to claw back control. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, you don't understand how banking works." Chris folded his arms, unbothered. "Maybe not, but I do understand when someone's being taken advantage of." A murmur rippled through the room. Customers who'd been silent spectators suddenly leaned in, eyes sharp with curiosity. Chris held up the paper, his voice cutting through the tension. "These fees started popping up 2 months ago. Can you explain why?" David faltered. "Bank policies change, and customers need to adapt." Chris shook his head, his tone icy. "That's not an answer. That's an excuse." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice just enough. "How many of you have been hit with unexpected fees in the past few months?" Dead silence at first. Then one hand crept up, then another. Within moments, over a dozen arms were raised, a quiet rebellion sparking in the air. David's face drained of color, sweat beading on his brow. Chris zeroed in on him. "So, it's not just her. Your bank's been quietly tacking on extra fees, hoping folks won't notice. Jessica shifted awkwardly, eyes darting to the floor. Chris pointed at the computer. Pull up her account. Let's see if these charges hold water. David froze, his fingers twitching. Chris smirked, cool as ever. What's wrong? I thought everything was clear for people who pay attention. Jessica's hands hesitated, then started typing. The screen flickered to life. The truth was seconds away from breaking free. Chris leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the glowing screen. Then, a low chuckle rumbled from his chest. Well, would you look at that? He tapped the monitor with a finger. These charges kicked in right after a policy change targeting senior accounts. The crowd buzzed, a wave of whispers rolling through the lobby. Chris spun to face David, his voice steady but piercing. This isn't about maintaining balances. It's about preying on folks who won't fight back. David's mouth flapped open, but nothing came out. Just a strangled gulp. Chris arched an eyebrow, cool as steel. So, here's what's going to happen. You're reversing these charges for everyone who's been hit, and you're apologizing. David's Adam's apple bobbed hard. Chris stepped closer, towering without even trying. Or, we can let the media chew on this. I bet they'd kill for a story about a bank fleecing elderly customers. From the back, a kid in a hoodie piped up, waving his phone. Too late, man. This is already live streaming. David's face flared crimson, sweat glistening under the fluorescent lights. Fix it, he hissed at Jessica, voice cracking. She nodded fast, fingers dancing over the keys like her job depended on it. And maybe it did. One by one, the fees melted off Margaret's account. Customers around the room pulled out phones, gasping as their own balances corrected, money slipping back where it belonged. Chris gave a curt nod. That's more like it. David's shoulders sagged, defeat etched into his posture. I apologize. Chris tilted his head, unimpressed. Try again. David exhaled, a broken man. Mrs. Collins, I sincerely apologize for how you were treated. It was wrong. Margaret eyed him, her gaze steady, then offered a small, dignified nod. Thank you. Chris turned to the crowd, his voice ringing clear. Let this be a lesson. Stand up, speak out, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't matter. The room broke into soft applause, a ripple of respect spreading through the air. Chris tugged his cap back on, tipping it slightly as he faced Margaret. Take care, ma'am. Her lips curved into a grateful smile. Thank you, Mr. Carter. You made me feel seen. He winked, easy and warm. You always were. Just needed a little reminder. And with that, he strode out, leaving the bank quieter, but stronger, than he'd found it. A few days later, an envelope slipped through Margaret's mailbox. Inside, a handwritten note waited. Mrs. Collins, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile. Chris folded neatly beneath was a signed NFL jersey, crisp and bold, alongside an invitation to an upcoming game. Margaret laughed, a tear slipping down her cheek as she brushed it away. She felt valued, respected, unstoppable. For the first time in a while, the world seemed to cheer her on. What would you have done in this situation? Speak up or stay quiet. Drop a 1 if you'd stand up for what's right. Drop a 2 if you think banks need to step up their game. Or share your thoughts. We're dying to hear from you.